Good morning. It is currently 7:40 a.m. Thursday, November 17th, and I'm coming at you on US Highway 54 in Encino, New Mexico. I stayed at the TA truck stop in Santa Rosa, New Mexico last night. Plenty of parking. It's a good place, pretty clean. But the fuel island is a little it can get a little bit crowded. Their pull-up line is pretty close to their building, and if you get somebody to your left that has pulled up, you may not be able to pull out until they do. Last night when I was going in, I actually saw a truck that looked like they were trying to pull out, and somebody pulled up to the line, blocking them in as they were trying to turn left to pull out of the fuel area. But you know, that's only going to be a big hassle when it's real busy, and there's not much of a way to get in line without being in the road. Each fuel lane can handle about like one truck after the truck is fueling. Other than that, you're pretty much going to be sitting in the road or in the lane of traffic going through the truck stop. But it is what it is, and we just kind of got to deal with all that stuff. My load today is a bunch of steel utility poles that I'm taking to Tucson, Arizona from Salina, Kansas. I haven't ran this load yet, and normally I run pretty much all Midwest, from about Michigan all the way down to Texas, and then all the way over to, I've been down to Georgia a couple of times, but typically I'll run the lanes in that area. So when this came up, I told my broker this is what I wanted because it'll give me the opportunity to get out and run some areas that I haven't been in and some areas that I haven't seen in a long time, since my days of training anyway. Because when I was with Knight, when I first started training, we ran all over, and we were all over the West Coast and all over the Western states, and so I kind of wanted to get out here and get back out here and see some of the stuff. It's kind of pretty driving through here. As you can see, I got some greenery. It was pretty desolate looking, and everything was real brown, but all of a sudden I came into a lot of green trees, and I think it's kind of pretty out here, even though, even though there's really nothing out here. The truck stops are definitely far and few between. I basically, when I got to the TA, I basically had a TA, a Love's, and a Pilot right there amongst all each other, and then I think maybe one mom and pop store. After that, I had about two that I could choose from. Then after that, I wouldn't have enough hours on my clocks to get to the next one, and I had 2 hours when I stopped last night. And usually when I have a 2-day run like this, I like to max out my first clock so that way my second day isn't so bad. But I woke up and I still had about 550 miles to go. To get to my delivery, and it's going to deliver probably tomorrow morning. I'm going to call them here in a little bit to see if they accept delivery past 3 p.m. because that's what the rate con says is 3 p.m. However, I have a tracker that is required for this company that makes these poles now. And the tracker says they do delivery until 5 p.m. So we'll see. We'll see what it is. If they deliver if they take deliveries until 5, then I'll go on out there and I'll deliver it just to get it off my back. I'll go find a closed truck stop so that way I have fresh clocks in the morning to get a load and start working my way back home for Thanksgiving. My plan is I'm going to stay out the weekend, obviously, and be back Tuesday or Wednesday probably. take the rest of that week off, and then hit it hard again the next Monday. So anyway, so if you haven't ever seen my videos before, I'm a retired cop. I'm a detective, and I've got stories to tell. I think they're interesting. I've told stories to a few people before, and basically what was everyday occurrences to me is actually kind of interesting. I found a lot of people. There's a lot of stuff going on in this world that people just don't realize. You know, we had about 32, 33 detectives. Most of them were case carrying detectives, because we had some detectives that were assigned to specialty units, and they didn't have to carry a caseload. And just me myself would investigate anywhere from 125 to 150 cases a year. And that's just the ones that need investigation. There's a lot of cases that are direct referrals that don't require investigation. And really only a small percentage of what we investigate gets charged. And also only a small percentage of the direct referrals get charged. But anyway, I told the story before when I had a channel before, but I deleted a video by mistake, and I was trying to change some things in my channel and realized that I just deleted the whole channel. So I basically had to start all over. But anyway, so this is a story about a crooked jewelry store owner. And I mean, it was a pretty interesting investigation. So it all started out, I was the standby detective, and when I was a standby detective, basically if they needed a detective and there weren't any on duty, then they could call me back and I would work overtime. And we had a rotation of that, and it just so happened to be my week to be standby detective. And during that time, we actually had partner detectives that would be on standby with us. So me and this other detective, we get called back for a burglary case. Officers had caught a guy committing, or at least no, they caught him with a bunch of stolen stuff, and they identified it as being taken in a burglary, and they wanted us to come in and talk to him. Well, when I first started talking to him, I kind of got the idea that this is pretty big. Like it's a lot more than just him taking a crime of opportunity and breaking into somebody's house. Like, I could tell that this is pretty big. And what it ended up being was a big burglary ring. There were about, I don't know, half a dozen or so people involved in this ring. And let me throw a quick disclaimer out that I've thrown out every once in a while before. My reports and my investigations are what's accurate. I might be a little off here and there on my stories because I'm going 100% from memory. And so I might be off. It could have been 10 people involved in this burglary ring. It could have been 4. But we'll call it, around 6 or so. But I just remember it being a burglary ring, and they would go out and commit burglaries and take their items that they got, and they would sell them to fences. They would sell them to people who would basically acting like a pawn shop. They would take their item in, give them a little bit of cash, and then they would turn around and resell that item. Well, they were taking the televisions to a car dealership, a local car dealership, and this car dealership was a front for a drug operation. And honestly, it was kind of common knowledge. At one point, we had some covert cameras, or at least some narcotics officers had some covert cameras put on this business, and it's long gone out of business. And the guy that used to own it has changed his life, turned around. He's super religious now, and as far as I can tell, doesn't commit a crime. And I mean, he is super, super religious. But anyway, well, they would take their electronics and televisions and such to him and sell, then he would resell them. Well, they were taking their jewelry to a jewelry store. And during my interview of the suspect that got caught, he kept kind of like just throwing a little bit of a bait out there just to keep me intrigued about the jewelry. And he hadn't told me yet that they took their jewelry to a jewelry store, but he just kept dangling this carrot out in front of me. And I'd be like, I'd keep wanting to talk to him, just keep wanting to go. And I remember the other detective was wanting to leave because we had a really bad storm coming in. I mean, it was like really bad, like it was going to have some tornado warnings and watches associated with it, and it was just a real bad storm. So she wanted to leave, and but I was just really intrigued with this guy and didn't want to. Well, eventually he told me that they take their stolen jewelry to a local jewelry store, and this jewelry store it was a local standalone jewelry store, not affiliated with any national chains. It was one local guy that owned a jewelry store, and it was him, his wife, and one or two maybe other employees. I know one other employee, but maybe the occasional second part-time employee or something like that. But when they got busted, it was him, his wife, and the one employee. So he talked about how this guy was actually like fund their burglaries. Like he would rent them a car so they could go out and commit a burglary. And then they would bring their stolen jewelry to him. In fact, he told me about a ring, and I forget what size diamond it was, but it was this pretty significant ring. And he told me how much this guy sold it, or how much he sold it to the jewelry store for. And I immediately was like I'm on this recorded interview, and I told this guy, I said, man, you got ripped off. And I want to say he got like $500. And I told him, I said, man, you got ripped off. That's like a $5,000 or $6,000 ring. And he was like, well, what am I going to do? I know it's stolen because I stole it, So he's like, basically, I take the money that he's going to offer me. But what I heard was how this guy was moving the stuff was he was selling it to other people he was involved with. He was into drag racing, and he actually had two drag racing Camaros. They're called Copa Camaros, C-O-P-A, and they are drag cars, and they're very expensive. Back then, I want to say they're around $100,000 a piece, and he had two of them. And he lived in a really big, nice house, had a really big, nice RV, and took his wife and his employee and her husband on very nice vacations every year, all on his jewelry store earnings, which really weren't that much. And I'll get into that here in a little bit. So what he would do is he would sell these things, sell rings to these people, but he would also do things like pop the jewels out of the rings and bracelets and stuff, and he would or he would sell the gold as scrap or have it melted down, and that was found to be like the whole melting of scrap metal. That's just a big, huge, shady business. But anyway, so he was doing all that to move the stuff. So this guy, the suspect that I had in custody, became like 100% cooperative. It got to the point to where I want to say the courts appointed an attorney to represent him because he was going to work with us and like flip on everybody. And I even asked him at one point, because he seemed to have a little bit of fun telling me the stories. And I asked him, I said, man, aren't you worried about getting labeled as a snitch? And, aren't you worried about being a snitch? And he says, no. He says, nah, we all snitch on each other. It's okay. So I just kind of laughed and was like, okay. So what we did was, another detective got involved at this point, because at that time I was in homicide. And they didn't want to, and basically as a standby detective, I would investigate anything that would take, anywhere from a day to a week to investigate. I could handle that kind of a case. But this was going to turn into a huge case, and they didn't want to tie me up on this huge months-long investigation. So they brought in another detective, but they kept me around to do things like interview this guy because I had a really good rapport with him, and kept me around for assisting on smaller tasks that's not going to take much more than a day or two. So one of the things that the burglary detective did was he went through, or had our crime analyst go through our burglaries and link the burglaries that appeared to be similar, have the same MO, the modus operandi. And they made a book that had all these cases in there, and they gave it to me. It was a notebook, and it had dividers in there for each case. Basically, they would have a picture of the house that got burgled. They would have the offense report and a list of the items that got stolen. And I was showing this guy, I'd show him the house and say, okay, what about this address? And he goes, yeah, from that address we got a 42-inch television, 2 diamond rings, and a PS4. Turn to the next page, and exactly what he told me was in there. And he kept doing this. Like, we went through, I bet, probably 24 cases before he finally got to a house and said, I don't know much about that one. I don't know anything about that one. And really, that was kind of a sigh of relief, because we didn't want everything to be perfect. I mean, that's crazy, that everything would be just perfect. But he even, at one point, just to legitimize everything, or in my mind, this legitimized the whole thing. At one point, I showed him a house, and he says, yeah, we've got this, this, and this out of that house. I turned the page. Sure enough, this, this, and this is listed on the items that were stolen from the house. And then, without any provocation or prompting or being showed any clues of any kind, he said, and we busted into the neighboring house the next day, and we stole this, this, and this, and this from that house. I turned the page, and that's the house that was next in line. And I was like, holy smokes. I mean, it was just perfect. And he might have even done that twice during that interview, but he definitely did it once. So anyway, we decided we're going to set up this big, huge operation and bust the jewelry store owner, and we ended up getting the FBI involved. They actually gave us a bunch of jewelry to do a buy bust with, basically, or a sell bust, I guess, with. And everything was all cool. He made a controlled phone call to the jewelry store owner and was like, hey, yo, I'm gonna come in. I got a few things I want to show you. I'm gonna come in. The jewelry store owner was like, yeah, absolutely, man. See you tomorrow. And anytime anybody went in to sell anything, like from his crew, they always dealt with the owner. They didn't deal with his wife very often. Well, okay. More often than not, they dealt with the owner. They might have dealt with the wife and the other employee every once in a while, but most of the time I seem to remember that it was with the owner. So, so this operation got huge. Like, there ended up being a lot of cops involved, a lot of our cops involved, the FBI was involved, a lot of people knew about it. There were people, sticking their noses in it and they're giving their opinions, mainly management. And me, I like to run things small and tight. It can be big, it can be a big operation, but I'd still want to keep the involvement small and tight, just a circle. But other people got involved, and soon it was just common knowledge throughout the police department, which it comes into play here in a minute, or the size of the investigation and why it shouldn't have gotten so large will definitely come into play. So he makes the control phone call. The guy's all cool. Yeah, bring the stuff in. So he goes into the jewelry store the next day and is immediately confronted by the owner. Like, didn't even say anything to the owner, just walks up. The owner walks up to him and says, I don't buy stolen stuff. You need to get out of my store. So he leaves, and he had a wire on at that time. So he leaves, and we all regroup back at the police station, and we kind of come to the conclusion that obviously he was warned, and he was probably warned by a cop. And what I can tell you is he was very popular in town. At one point, a retired cop, a cop that he was actually retired during the investigation, but his wife worked for him at one point. He was friends with him at one point. I don't know what their relationship status was at the point of the investigation. But he would give deals to city employees, which included cops. Basically, he had a lot of repeat business that were cops and firefighters and hospital staff, and a couple of big companies in town. Their employees went to him because he gave discounts to them because they were because the people that they worked for were huge employers of the city. Like they would employ like 500-600 people. So he's very popular. Well, we came to the conclusion that we think he was warned by a cop. So then we decided what we're going to do. Then we decided we would go ahead and raid his business because we had everything we needed. If we could do a sell bust, then if we could sell him the stolen jewelry that the FBI gave us, then that'd just be icing on the cake, in my opinion. That's the gravy's on the taters, man. I mean that's just that. It's just a bonus because we had a solid case because we had that one controlled phone call and I think other controlled phone calls also. I think there was at least one more where it was clearly that's what was going on. That he was knowingly taking in stolen stuff. So we ended up doing a raid on the jewelry store. Basically shut it down, take everybody in custody, the husband, the wife, and the employee, take them all to the police station for interviewing, shut the jewelry store down and post a guard up in the jewelry store. And I'm interviewing the one employee that basically was the manager. And I remember I was interviewing her and she was telling me about the vacations that they go on, and we were talking about him in general, and I asked her, I said, so how is he paid? What is his salary like? And I said, if the jewelry store has a good year, does he have a good year? And, basically is his salary dependent on what the jewelry store does? And she says, no, not really. He gets paid a regular base salary. And I said, okay, so what's his salary? And she said, oh, it's about $80,000 a year. And I told her, without missing a beat, I said, I make about $80,000 a year, and I can't afford half the crap that he has. Don't you think that's a little suspicious? Well, about that time, the interview was actually being played live into a conference room, and there were lots of higher-ups watching the interview. And my major at the time, he even said, the guy interviewing her makes that kind of money. So, but anyway, because like I said, he had at least $200,000 worth of drag cars, which that's an expensive hobby to even maintain. So, he was drag racing, had a big, nice house, and I mean a big, nice house, big, real nice RV, and all on basically $80,000 a year. So, and eventually not eventually, but she actually admitted that, yes, that sounds pretty sketchy. Right now I'm passing through Corona, New Mexico. It's kind of a cute little town. I like these old towns that look like just time stood still. Like it's got all the old rock buildings still. I'm one of these people, I'm just fascinated with history. And I like to hear about the history of towns, and I mean, my ultimate vacations include like being able to go to basically towns that time has forgotten. Like I want to see hitching posts outside of businesses and such. But anyway, so back to my story of the crooked jewelry store owner. He was interviewed, and I don't remember if he exercised his right to remain silent or if he lawyered up or whatever, but he was offered a sweetheart of a deal. They said basically they would give him probation if he told us who alerted him to the bust. But he was a good soldier and would not do it. He stood his ground and was basically like, don't know what you're talking about. And I want to say we dumped his cell phone records, and I think there was like a strange call that came in to his cell phone from, I think, a payphone. And yeah, back then there were still a few payphones around town. Heck, there's still actually one in my town that I know of. But so we were never really able to pin it on anything. The detective that took over the investigation, because the whole investigation ended up taking about 9 months, and for about 6 to 9 months, that's the only thing that he investigated was that case. And like I said, he was a burglary detective, so that was his job, and they didn't want to take me away from investigating homicides for that. But anyway, this detective had an idea of who done it, and he was actually very vocal about his thoughts and why he believed this cop alerted him to the raid. And he wasn't afraid, even if this cop never confronted him about it or anything. And he actually retired. He was in the process of retiring anyway, and so he'd retired kind of during the investigation, I believe. Not because of the investigation, but because he was in the process of that anyway. But this cop, as far as I know, never confronted him. And this detective, he wouldn't have cared. He would have called him, had this cop even tried to confront him, he would have called him out, because he believes 100% he knows who alerted the jewelry store owner and was pissed. But the jewelry store owner, he ended up doing, I think, 1 year and 1 day in the federal penitentiary for a list of federal crimes. It wouldn't be just burglary or theft or anything like that. It had to do, it was just things like wire fraud or whatever. But he ended up doing 1 year and a day in federal prison, and did that instead of giving up the person who alerted him. And basically, whenever he was asked about it, he was like, don't know what you're talking about. Nobody ever alerted me about anything. So he was a good soldier, and he did his time. So I guess sometimes there is honor amongst thieves. Definitely wasn't any honor amongst the thief that started the whole thing. But in any case, the guy ended up losing his jewelry store business. The banks ended up repoing a bunch of stuff. I wanted a complete seizure, but he owed money on a lot of his things, and but it wasn't a lot of money. I mean, basically, from the way I understand it, if we would have seized everything, we could have paid what was owed and then auction it off or use it for our own purposes. And hell, we could have used an RV, could have turned that into a really nice mobile command center. But even the jewelry store, I think he owned the building, and we didn't even, I think there was a favor, to be honest with you, in there, because we didn't seize any of his product. We didn't seize any of his store or anything. Basically, it was all released back to his control, and the bank ended up coming in. I don't know what he did with his merchandise, but the bank basically came in and repoed, or he voluntarily gave back the building to the bank. I wanted them to take everything, take the building, and actually turn the building into a substation for homicide and special victims detectives. But the greater minds, I guess, prevailed, and they were like, no, that's too much of a hassle, we're not doing it. But like I said, I've always had in the back of my mind that maybe there was a favor going on around in there, because he was able to recoup quite a bit of losses, I think, by selling off some stuff. And on a side note, I actually worked another case sometime after that, and it involved a car dealership that where somebody bought a truck using the stolen identity of somebody else. And I go to the car dealership to interview them, and lo and behold, the jewelry store owner is now a used car salesman. And there was a little bit of fishy stuff going on with that one. I'm going to tell that one in my next story, I think, because that guy was very interesting, and the car dealership was a little bit fishy as well. So until next time, y'all have a good day.